And we are working, it's working and we're live. Jack Donovan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So, for those who don't know you, you are the author of many great books, Way of Man, Sky Without Eagles, Becoming a Barbarian, and recently Fire in the Dark. And of course, you have your blog and many other activities that people should discover. How have you been doing?
Oh, I've been doing great. I think there's a lot of material in the Fire in the Dark ideas, and I've been I started a group recently called the Order of Fire, and I've been building that out and just really digging into that because I think there's so much there and so much potential for the future.
I agree, and I think people should read or rediscover the Way of Man in the light of Fire in the Dark. So, how does all these books link together now that you have the perspective of over a decade of successful writing about this topic and living this topic as well? How does these topics fit together, and how the books create that chain of thought and behavior?
Well, it really is kind of a journey. I think people always ask what order they should read my books in, and I'm like from beginning to end because I become a different person, but certain things always stay true. And the things in the Way of Men, there are things that I go back in my work and I read and I'm like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have said that way. But the Way of Men, I still agree with everything in it. Everything in it is still true. And I think one of the biggest ideas that the Way of Men offered was the idea that the Way of Men is the way of the gang, and also the idea of the perimeter. And it's such a universal concept, and any military that goes and takes a space, that's exactly what they have to do: set up a perimeter, create a security zone, then everything that they care about is protected in the center. It's universally true. And that's just the way men have been doing things for, since they discovered fire. And probably before that, but fire kind of helps set that up because fire actually creates a natural perimeter of light. And so it actually establishes a perimeter. Everything out of it you can't see, and that's chaos, and everything inside of it is order. And so I think what I did with Fire in the Dark is went back to that idea of the perimeter and really built it out. And really it talked about we've been doing this thing, building this fire and creating order within this space for all of human history. And this is really fundamental to what men do. And I looked at it as how does it affect what we think in terms of ideals and our world and how we control it, and from a more philosophical perspective. Like the Way of Men is very practical, and but people also talk around fires, and that's where the culture begins. Really, is all this exchange of ideas, and that's where men had time to talk. They're just sitting around a fire. If you've ever sat around a fire outside, men talk late into the night about all kinds of ideas, and so this is where I think our ideals and our higher ideals really come from, and so. I tried to relate that to these archetypes that we see repeated over and over again through mythology and religion and so forth. And that's what really Fire in the Dark is about. Let's come up with all these things that we knew in the past, that we've repeated over and over and again in different mythologies and religions. And we're in this place in history where we can see all of the things that our ancestors couldn't. Because our ancestors would be like, you might not move more than 50 miles from where you grew up your entire life. But we can see everything that's happened that's ever been recorded for the entire history of human life. And that was a really big, weird thing that happened in the 19th century, is that they discovered the tablets that were the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that kind of screwed up the Bible for everybody because they thought that the Bible established the beginning of time. But then this is a few thousand years older, and there's a flood myth in it, and it's the same thing that's earlier. And so when you really look at all these things, there's this bigger perspective that you can gather. And so that's what rather than trying to say, everybody wants to go back to some point in history and relive it, but we can't do that. There's no way we can do that from here. So take everything that we know and start from there. And what's basic? What are the first principles of all this? And that's why I kind of went back to the fire. And these basic ideas were these higher ideals of man that we were always trying to reach up towards.
When I was reading The Way of Man the first time, many years ago now, I remember that my father was telling me the stories of Rome when I was a kid. And indeed, you are foretelling also that same story of how Rome was founded. by a group of thieves, and a gang basically was created that was probably going to pillage and steal a few cows here and there, a few sheep from neighboring tribes and cities. And eventually that tribe, as you describe indeed in the book, the first thing they do is they define a perimeter. They find a spot that maybe no one wants with a few hills that they can control. They set a perimeter and they make it holy. They make that perimeter holy. This is why one of the brothers, Romolo, says, well, I don't give a fuck about your perimeter and about this holy thing. I can do what I want. I can cross it or not. And the brother kills him for that, and probably through a ritual duel. But what is interesting is that there is very quickly that symbiosis of the physical, which is the strength, the capacity to defend that perimeter through the skills, all these tactical virtues that you describe in The Way of Man, courage, strength, honor, mastership. That's perhaps not the right word.
Mastery. Yeah.
Mastery, almost. And at the same time, very quickly, around the fire and around the perimeter, you define the spiritual aspect. You find the other world that you ask for protection, and you ask for ointment to make what you are doing holy.
Yes.
And therefore, like, beyond man and the world goes to a metaphysical aspect. And I found this fascinating. Again, when I read Fire in the Dark, I had to reread the Way of Man and put that into linkage. In your study, because your book is full of studies about Norse myth, about the Roman and other pagan myths, how do you see, and in fact, we could go into Christianity's, the ointment, the eating of the Christ. There's a lot of symbolism that
Yahweh is just another thunder and lightning sky god. I mean, that's basically, it's the same thing. It's the same guy. Yeah.
Another alpha god. And how in your research do you see the fundamental commons between all these myths and all these stories, which are all the stories of man and creating civilizations from that?
Well, I think in this idea of creating the fire and then having that represent your higher ideals, because, okay, if you started a group and you're sitting at, well, what are we about? Anytime you define a group, you start a company, you start thinking, what are we even about? What do we care about? What are our higher ideals? And that's really what you're protecting. That becomes your culture. And fire has actually been a symbol for cultures, like the fire, eternal. A lot of cultures have eternal flames that you have to keep alive. And then eventually, if they go out, that probably means the culture's dead. This fire has been a symbol for culture for thousands and thousands of years. But some of the ideas that I hit on, I looked at different studies of mythology that are cross-cultural and so forth. And there's Dumézil's tripartite system of Indo-Europeans, and I love the work of Mircea Eliade, and his talk about what is sacred and what's profane is really fundamental to how I understand all of this. But what I really looked at is, what are these? You can break. Paganism tends to be about ideas. If you look at like the ancient Greeks and Romans, they made gods about like everything. And a lot of times that god barely didn't even have a character. It was just an idea. Like virtue was a woman, but really nothing else happened. She didn't have a story. Like virtue, it's a woman, so they personified everything. And so when I think as cultures progress, they try to personify every little detail. And the Catholics kind of did that with saints. Like we have a saint for everything. And the pagans did that too. You could be in a cult of almost anything in ancient Rome or ancient Greece. But, I tried to look at what are the main ideas. And the main ideas that I found are these kind of three systems. The Americans came up with the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. That's a very popular book. And that's a good idea too. I kind of compacted them a little bit more like Dumézil did. And so I looked at it as, well, what's, the primary one is always the father. There's always a father god. And I think the easiest way to explain that to people is that, when you're a young man, who do you look up to? Well, your father. Literally, you look up to your father. You have to. He's taller than you. And then you take that and then, well, what's beyond him? Because you're never going to become him. You're going to become like him. But what is the ideal of him? What is the higher Platonic form of the father? And I think that's how it naturally progresses in our minds up to like, what is this father figure, this higher ideal, the ultimate man who controls things and has things together, and really this kind of king god figure. And almost every, religion has something like that. This father who, basically keeps order and oversees everything. And so the father is one of the major archetypes that I think you find over and over again. And men have to become fathers in their own households, in their businesses, all kinds of things. It's very relatable. Fathers, create order. They draw lines. All the linguistic stuff all wraps up. It's like Rex, a ruler. It comes back to roots that go to like drawing lines and so forth. They keep things right. They keep things in order. And so that's what fathers really do, is they make the rules, and in the way the king does. And then you have the striker figure, which is really the way of men is all about the striker, because that's what we have to, the strength, courage, mastery, and honor are what we need to do to defend that space. And that's what strikers do. And that's where you always have the thunder gods. And those two things are very related, because they're the gods of the storm, which is storm, if you really think about it, is the heavens when they get angry. It's the lightning, and they always have lightning associated. Lightning is like literally like the heavens striking the ground. It's this very powerful idea. And, you see it repeated again and again. You can even get into like, Aztec culture. Well, not Aztec, but the Mayans and so forth. They have Huracan or whatever, like the, god of the storm. You see it repeated over and over again. And a lot of what happens with these striker figures is that they are, the main god is actually, the father god is actually an ascended striker. Like, in the way that, and this goes back to the Romulus and Remus story, like they conquered land, whatever, and then become king, because and you see Zeus, he had to fight, the great beasts and overthrow the Titans before him to then become the leader of Olympus. And you see this over and over again. And the same in the Rig Veda, you have Indra, has to have a great fight, and we can talk about him later too, because he relates to Conan in a way that I think you and I both like Conan. But Indra fights this kind of like force that's withholding all the water from the people, and he releases it, and then becomes king. And so you see that over and over again. So you have the striker that often, not every striker becomes a king, but the king was usually a striker. And so that's an idea. And then men tend to fixate on kings and strikers as their primary ideals. But most of the work that we do in life is just keeping things going. We just, you have to do accounting, and you have to do farming, and you have to do all these things that manage the land. You have to, deal with your women and your children and all the things and that's a different kind of mode.
Yeah, and the killing, the raping, and the pillaging has to wait sometimes.
Yeah, it's just really a small part of life. Yeah. At some point, you still have to eat. You have to do all these other things that need to get done, and that's really what I think of as the Lord of the Earth, because we are from the earth. We are not really from the sky. We look upward towards the sky and higher ideals and so forth, but we're from the earth, and we still have to deal with the fact that we're animals and that we're human. And then you see that figure repeated in very different ways throughout different mythology. That I kind of had to push that one together because there's all kinds of different aspects that come together. But, like obviously you have the Dionysian things in the ancient Greece and so forth. And, because people also like to have fun, and they like to, it's not all about being a rules and striker. People also want, let's have wine and have a nice party, that is also part of being a man. And that there's this great set of lines, and I can't quote them exactly, obviously, but from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is obviously the oldest story in the world. And he goes out and talks to this, he's on his quest for eternal life, and he runs into this woman that makes wine, and she sits him down, and she's like, well, you are going to die. You're not going to live forever, but take time to enjoy life. Enjoy holding a baby, enjoy like drinking some wine, enjoy making love to your wife, enjoy life and what it has to offer. And that's a very Lord of the Earth kind of sentiment. It comes from a woman in that story, but it's reminding him that being a man is also those things too. So, and I talked about those things in The Way of Men, and so it was really great to come back full circle to all these ideas and see them repeated over and over again in myth, and take it from that angle.
Yeah, in fact, what you just said because it echoes to one of the chapters in my next book, but certainly reminds me the story of when Odysseus is in his quest to go back home. At some point, he spends quite many years with the witch Circe,
Yes.
because she says to him, "Look, you have been at war for 10 years. Now you've been with your crew going around the Mediterranean trying to find your way home. Why don't you spend a few, here we have, first of all, you have me, I'm a good-looking witch, and you have good wine and good food, and you can stay here. It's around the Rome and Naples, that area where it was supposed to be, and it's a place where is really good food and wine, and you can imagine that he's had these few years of just relaxing and taking the rest from all his quests, and yet at some point he says, well, wait, hold on a second, I actually need to go back to my kingdom and I cannot just do that. So I completely agree that you cannot have one without the other. It's again the yin and yang that Jung liked to talk about when he studied the Eastern philosophies. You have to have both the pleasure and the rest, as well as the fighting and the conquest. As indeed in Ecclesiastes, I really like this chapter of the Bible. It's probably the best because it's probably the least godlike, God-inspired, but it's probably the most earth-based, where they say there is a time for everything: a time for war, a time for peace, a time for sleep, a time for and a time for love, and a time for hate. And it's very profound. If one reads them again, it's really a few pages, very quick.
Yeah. Isn't that a song?
It probably was coined.
I think it's a song from the 60s. Yeah. Yeah.
Probably also, but if you look Ecclesiastes, it's the last chapter of the Torah, the Jewish Bible, and it's bizarrely Christian for the Jewish text. So it's kind of a precursor. You can feel the Greek influence in it. Let's put it this way. It's really worth reading. It's probably 20 pages. It's very quick to read. It's a really great piece of wisdom. So yeah, these characters that you describe in Fire in the Dark really make starting the world possible, because this was perhaps, as you said, there are things you would have said differently. Of course, we all grow wiser and older, and older for sure, wiser, let's hope. But certainly in the way of man, you conclude that book with the fact that we need to start the world, because there's no point, as you said, there's no point complaining. And there's no point, in the second part of this interview, we can complain about the current world, but it's funny that as a Stoic would say, well, I cannot control the way the world goes, so I don't care. I'm just going to control myself, and starting the world makes sense. However, starting the world without that spiritual aspect that you describe in Fire in the Dark, it's impossible.
Well, yeah, and the way I frame this these days is really as a battle against nihilism.
Yeah,
and that's what, because there's a perspective that you could take, and I have an essay about this called the Dragon of Negation, and basically it's this conversation that a warrior has with a dragon, and to be honest, the Dragon of Chaos, and is like, well, you're gonna die and no one will remember your name, and so it doesn't really matter what you do, so you might just enjoy yourself, and who cares about anything, and it's not really wrong. But and that's where they get people. But well, is that what you want your life to be? And then the opposite is, well, choose what you actually believe in. What do you think is good? What is the opposite of just doing whatever because who cares? And so yeah, I mean that's how you have to create a culture based on something that isn't nihilism. Something that is we believe that we should behave in a certain way. We want to what do we think is beautiful? What do we think is good? So those things are, extremely important.
Oh yeah, in fact, what you just said reminds me of that famous Shelley poem, by Percy Shelley, Ozymandias. I don't know how you say it.
Yes, Ozymandias, yeah.
And it's a fantastic poem where basically, I have it in French here. I want it in English. What's the text that is fantastic? It's I have it here. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Yeah, everything disappears. Even the Great Pyramids will disappear one day. It, as the Buddhists say, in the end, nothing matters, and yet everything matters. And this is the fantastic thing about humans. This is why all these silly people that look at transhumanism want to make us immortal. First of all, there's no way they can make it. But second of all, that's silly. It is because we're human that we can have this experience of being human, which is a fantastic one if you do it right, or maybe even a painful one, and you can be useful as a warning to other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we go to the second part of this chat, what are your next projects? What are your next thoughts and projects? Yeah.
Well, I'm not really writing anything right now, so I'm really focused on, writing little bits of pieces of things here and there. But I really thought the ideas in Fire in the Dark were worth building, because you can just put a book out there and it's just like, I had an idea, and then unless it becomes something and has a life of its own, it just is an idea. And so I'm like, well, what would this look like if we really wanted to start the world and wanted to make our own culture started from now? How would we do that? And so I've started a small men's organization, and we actually just had our first meetup recently, our first big one. And I actually did exactly what we did in Fire in the Dark, is we backpacked out into the woods and built a fire, and then made it a sacred fire. And then, talked about what our actual values are, and actually claimed the territory. We had flags and the whole thing. So we really wanted to reenact that in a mythic way. And so people were so afraid of what people going to say, oh, like, well, you're just LARPing, or you're just doing, you're just pretending to be something else. I'm like, no, I made this up. We're pretending to be exactly what I said, and that's what all these guys did, they, whether you're Romulus or whatever, they took the initiative at the time and said, hey, this is what I think the best way is. Let's try this. And got a few guys on board and move forward. And that's what you have to do. You can't just complain about the world being bad. If you have a vision for it, like, put it into action and do it. So that's really my thing is, it's a tough thing. It's, herding cats a little bit, like getting groups of men together and doing things, but I'm excited about it, and it's coming along. So,
and so far, no animals were harmed in the process.
No. I don't really think that's necessary. The thing is with that kind of stuff is that if you really look to the past, especially because we, as a group, we read, a lot of them have just read the Odyssey and Epic Gilgamesh. We kind of read all those books together, and we did the Argonautica, Voyage of Argos, and if you really look at the way they did sacrifices in a lot of these things, and it's in Homer too. What they did, yes, they did this fantastic sacrifice, but it was really like saying grace.
Of course.
Like they killed the animals and then they made dinner for everybody. Exactly. That's just what they did. It wasn't like some weird thing, No,
they were actually probably giving to the gods the spleen and the part of the bones.
Yeah, because that myth about the trick where they trick the gods and they only get the bones, it's exactly. So they're like, here are the pieces that we don't really want, and then here's the feast for everybody, so.
Of course, no, but yeah, I'm joking. But what you say echoes to a lot. We in the prepping or survivalist thing, a lot of people say, well, until something bad really happens, it's all a sort of LARPing, because you're kind of you go to the range, you shoot your guns, you store some food, you do some gardening. I grow my food and I have my animals. Basically, it's a glorified small farm, but until the day it happens. But the point is you train, because when it happens, you know what to do. And so it doesn't matter whether it makes sense to the rest of the world, as long as it makes sense to you and your life is enjoyable and happy, because life alone in an office, in a car, commuting, it's not really, really interesting. However, with a group of friends or families or people, having your feast once in a while to celebrate the passing. We just had the equinox, so it's the time where you slaughter the young sheep, for example, and you have a feast which is what Easter is really, where you eat the baby sheep. What's the word in English? The
lamb.
The lamb, yeah. And it's a fantastic time with friends, with other families, And no wonder most religions have adapted, especially in the northern hemisphere, to the cycles of nature. You celebrate Christmas during the solstice of the winter. You celebrate the Saint John was a traditional Christian holiday in Europe, and that's around the 21st of June, because you celebrate the beginning of the time where you really have to work hard in the fields, and so on and so on and so on. And you celebrate that through a party, through happy times, not through a time of pain. So yeah, the dragon that I will certainly read that piece. The dragon of nihilism needs to be fought, because what else there is to do anyway? So yeah, I really like this idea that we have to do things because it's beautiful, because it's true, because it is the way, and there's we can only be ourselves if we do something glorious, even small but glorious. We will talk in the second part about commenting whatever is happening in the world these days. Let's chat which country we should ask Putin to invade, and whatever things come to our minds. Stay tuned. We'll be chatting in part 2.